The throne room of the Valori Dominion stretched so far that clouds actually formed near its ceiling, and the Grand Sovereign Kael'tharion sat upon a chair carved from the core of a dead star, watching his admirals gather like obedient insects before him. He had ruled for longer than most civilizations had existed, and in all that time he had never once tasted defeat, never once felt the sting of uncertainty, never once looked upon a star and thought it beyond his reach. Today was no different. His empire spanned 9,000 star systems, each one conquered and catalogued and bled dry of anything useful. And still it was not enough, because for a ruler like Kael'tharion, nothing would ever be enough until the last free world in the galaxy bent its knee. The War Council filled the chamber with the sharp clicking of boots on crystal floors as 36 admirals took their positions around the tactical sphere, a massive holographic display that showed the known galaxy in burning gold light, with Valori territory marked in deep violet. "We have reached the outer boundary of a new system," announced Fleet Commandant Yurith Solik, a tall and weathered officer whose face looked like it had been carved from gray stone, and then left in the rain for 100 years. He gestured, and the tactical sphere zoomed inward, past conquered territories and client states and buffer zones, until it settled on a small and unremarkable yellow star orbited by 8 planets. "The system is designated Sol," Solik continued, "and the third planet from the star supports a native population of approximately 10 billion beings who call themselves humans." A murmur of mild interest passed through the admirals, the way one might react to hearing about a new species of beetle. "Classification?" asked Kael'tharion, his voice deep and slow like grinding tectonic plates. "Class 7 Primitive, Grand Sovereign," replied High Oracle Salith from her position at the intelligence console, and she was a slender figure with silver eyes that always seemed to be looking at something nobody else could see. "Pre-faster-than-light travel, no unified planetary government, still burning carbon-based fuels for energy, societal development is fractured across competing nation-states." Laughter rippled through the War Council, and one admiral slapped his knee and said that perhaps they should send a scouting party of children to handle this one. Kael'tharion did not laugh, but a cold smile split his ancient face like a crack in marble. "I want the first Celestial Armada deployed," he said. The laughter stopped immediately. Solek blinked twice, which was the closest he ever came to showing surprise, and he said carefully, "Grand Sovereign, the first Celestial Armada consists of 12,000 warships, 3 planet-cracking siege engines, and carries 2 billion ground soldiers, and with respect, that is a force designed to shatter spacefaring empires, not to pacify a single pre-industrial world. I am aware of what it consists of, Commandant." "Of course, Grand Sovereign. The Seth hegemony has been probing our borders for the last decade," Kael'tharion said, rising from his throne, and when he stood, he was enormous, nearly 3 meters tall, with skin like polished obsidian. "They think us stretched thin, and they think us cautious, and I intend to show them what the Valori do to worlds that stand in our path, even worlds as pathetic as this one." He turned to look at the tiny blue dot on the tactical sphere. "We will take Earth, not because it matters, but because everything belongs to me, and I want the galaxy to watch us do it with the largest fleet we have ever assembled, so that every whispering diplomat and scheming rival understands that we do not simply conquer, we overwhelm." The admirals straightened their spines and saluted with fists against their chests. Chests. Because when the Grand Sovereign spoke like this, you either agreed or you disappeared. But High Oracle Salith did not salute, and instead she said quietly, "Grand Sovereign, I would like to note an anomaly in the intelligence data regarding Earth." Kael'tharion turned his burning eyes toward her, and lesser beings have been known to lose consciousness under that gaze, but Salith held firm. "The planet was electromagnetically active for approximately 150 years," she explained, pulling up waveform data on her console. Radio transmissions, television signals, radar pulses, satellite communications, all the normal noise of a developing technological civilization. And then, roughly 40 standard years ago, it all stopped. Stopped? Solek asked. Completely, Salith confirmed. One day they were broadcasting on every frequency we could detect, filling their local space with signals. And the next day there was absolute silence. Silence has continued to this day. Another admiral waved his hand dismissively and said they had probably destroyed themselves in a nuclear exchange, the way primitive species often did. Salith shook her head slowly and said if they had destroyed themselves, there would be residual radiation signatures and atmospheric contamination visible on our long-range scans. But instead the planet appears healthy. The population appears to have actually increased since the silence began, and every other developing civilization in our records gets louder as it advances, not quieter. She paused and then added, "Something changed on Earth 40 years ago, and I do not know what it was, and that concerns me deeply, and I would recommend a reconnaissance-first approach before committing the Armada." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Kael'tharion laughed, a sound like boulders tumbling down a mountainside, and he said, "You are frightened of silence, Oracle. Perhaps they simply learn to be quiet, the way prey animals learn to stop moving when a predator is near. And if so, then they are smarter than most primitives, and they already know what is coming." The admirals laughed with him, because that was what admirals did. Silith said nothing more, because she had learned long ago that there was a difference between wisdom and stubbornness, and that Kael'tharion had only ever possessed one of those qualities. And so the orders were given, and the first celestial armada began its assembly in the orbital shipyards above the throne world. 12,000 warships pulling free from their docking clamps like a swarm of iron wasps waking from a long sleep. And the planet crackers powered up their engines with a sound that could be felt in the bones of every living thing on the surface below. Commandant Solek stood on the bridge of his command ship and watched the fleet form up around him and thought to himself that this was then greatest concentration of military power the Dominion had ever aimed at a single target, and that using it against a world that did not even have starships was like using a supernova to light a candle. But orders were orders. 3 months the journey would take through the hyperstream corridors, and at the end of it they would find a small blue world full of primitive beings who had no idea what was about to fall on them from the sky. At least that was what everyone believed. Deep in her private chamber aboard the intelligence station, Salith sat alone in the dark and stared at her screen, because she had found something buried in the oldest data files, something that the long-range probes had captured decades ago, and that nobody had ever bothered to translate. It was a transmission from Earth, one of the last before the silence, broadcast on a frequency that should not have been detectable across interstellar distances, and yet somehow was. Through the translation matrix one more time, to be sure. The words appeared on her screen in crisp Valori script, and they read, "To any intelligence receiving this message, we see you. We are ready. Do not come." Salith stared at those words for a very long time, and she felt something she had not felt in 300 years of service to the Dominion. The first celestial armada dropped out of hyperstream at the edge of the Sol system, like a wound tearing open in the fabric of space, and 12,000 warships poured through the gap in a river of metal and fire that stretched across millions of kilometers. Sub-Commander Draven Cole stood at the observation window of the destroyer Ironfang and watched the fleet materialize around him. And even after 6 years in the Valori Navy, the sight still made his chest tight with something between pride and terror, because there was nothing quite like watching enough firepower to crack a dozen worlds arrange itself into battle formation against the backdrop of unfamiliar stars. He opened his personal journal and recorded his first impression of the Sol system, which was that it was remarkably ordinary, a yellow star surrounded by a handful of rocky and gaseous planets, the kind of system you could find 1,000 times over in any spiral arm of the galaxy. Muttered Shipmaster Golrin from the command chair behind him. And Golrin was the kind of officer who had survived so many campaigns that his body was more scar tissue than original skin, and his left eye had been replaced with a mechanical implant that glowed faint red in the dark. "Easy conquest, then," Cole replied with a smile. Golrin did not smile back and said, "The easy ones are the ones that kill you, boy." Across the fleet the mood was almost festive, and officers on dozens of ships were already placing bets on how quickly the humans would surrender, with the most optimistic wagers giving it less than an hour. And someone on the battlecruiser Starbreaker had started calling the whole operation the Shore Leave Invasion, because they expected to spend more time on the surface enjoying the scenery than actually fighting. But on the bridge of the command ship, Commandant Solek was not celebrating. He stood before the main sensor display with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw tight, and he studied the readings with the careful attention of a man who had learned long ago that the universe punished those who did not pay attention. "Report," he said to his sensor officer. "The system appears to be completely undefended, Commandant," the officer replied, and there was confusion in her voice. "No orbital defense platforms detected, no weapons satellites, no minefield, no patrol vessels, no stations of any kind anywhere in the system." Solek waited. "In fact, sir, there appears to be nothing artificial in orbit around Earth at all. No satellites, no space debris, no decommissioned hardware, nothing. The orbital space around the planet is entirely clean." That was the word that caught Solek's attention, and he turned it over in his mind the way a jeweler might turn over a suspicious gem. Clean. Every spacefaring world in the galaxy had orbital clutter, old satellites, and broken stations, and fragments of ancient launches that tumbled endlessly around the planet, like a belt of metal confetti. And even worlds that had never reached space usually had at least some natural debris captured by their gravity. But Earth's orbital space was pristine, as if someone had swept it clean on purpose, and Solek could think of no reason a primitive species would do that, unless they were not primitive at all. He opened a secure channel to High Oracle Salith, back on the throne world, and transmitted the sensor data without commentary. Her response came 14 minutes later, delayed by the vast distance, and it was only 2 sentences long. "If they have 10 billion people and no visible infrastructure, then where is the infrastructure? Do not proceed until you find the answer to that question." Solek considered this, but his orders from the Grand Sovereign were clear and unambiguous, and did not include the option of caution. And so he made a compromise with himself, and ordered a scout flotilla of 200 ships to advance ahead of the main fleet toward Earth at maximum speed, while the rest of the armada held position near the orbit of the 5th planet, a massive gas giant the humans apparently called Jupiter. The scout flotilla raced inward, crossing the asteroid belt in a formation that looked like an arrowhead aimed at the heart of the system. And aboard the Iron Fang sub-commander Cole watched the long-range feeds and waited for the scouts to report what they found. The report, when it came, made no sense. Surface scans show a population of approximately 10 billion beings, distributed evenly across all continental landmasses, the flotilla commander announced over the fleet channel. "But we are detecting 0 industrial signatures, 0 energy grid signatures, 0 mechanized transportation networks, 0 urban structures consistent with advanced civilization. The surface appears to be entirely natural, forests and grasslands, and rivers and oceans, with the population living in small distributed settlements that show no signs of technology above basic agriculture." Cole frowned and said to Golrin, "That cannot be right. You cannot support 10 billion people with basic agriculture. The math does not work." Golrin's mechanical eye flickered, and he said, "The math works fine if they are not using agriculture to feed themselves. The question is, what are they using?" The flotilla commander continued, "Recommend reclassification of target world from Class 7 primitive to Class 2 pre-industrial. There is no military threat here. This is a garden world populated by farmers." Across the fleet, the celebratory mood returned with even more force, and Cole could hear officers on adjacent channels talking about shore leave rotations and which hemisphere looked most pleasant for ground deployment. But Solek heard the report differently. 10 billion people with no visible means of support, no technology, no infrastructure, living on a world whose orbital space had been scrubbed clean of every trace of artificial material. He thought about Salid's question, and he thought about the silence that had fallen over Earth 40 years ago. And he thought about what kind of civilization could grow to 10 billion souls without leaving a single detectable footprint on the electromagnetic spectrum. And then he stopped thinking, because something happened that he had no framework to understand. Every sensor on every ship in the Armada activated simultaneously, not triggered by the crew, but triggered by something external. And across 12,000 warships, the same reading appeared on every screen at exactly the same moment. A single pulse of energy originating from the surface of Earth. Not a weapon and not a scan and not a communication signal, but something else entirely. A pulse that seemed to reach across the entire solar system in an instant, without any regard for the speed of light. Touching every ship, the way a hand might touch a row of chess pieces, just to confirm they were all still on the board. It lasted less than a second. Then it was gone, and every sensor returned to normal as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, because that pulse had not been a greeting, and it had not been a threat. It had been an acknowledgement. "We know you are here." The fleet channel erupted with confused and frightened chatter, and Solek silenced it with a single command, and then stood in the quiet of his bridge and stared at the small blue dot on the view screen. And for the first time in his long career, felt the cold crawl of something he refused to call fear, moving up his spine. On the Iron Fang, Call turned to Gulren and found the old shipmaster already strapping himself into his command harness and ordering the crew to battle stations. "What are you doing?" Call asked. "Sensor anomaly." Gulren looked at him with his one good eye and his one mechanical eye and said, "In 40 years of war, I have learned one thing, Sub-Commander, and it is this. When something that should be afraid of you lets you know that it can see you instead of hiding, it is not because they are brave, it is because you are already dead, and you just do not know it yet." Cole opened his journal and tried to write something, but found that his hands were shaking, and he did not know why. Below them, the blue planet turned slowly in the starlight, beautiful and silent and waiting, and the space around it was clean and empty and perfect, like a table that had been cleared before a meal. For 6 hours, Commandant Solek tried to contact Earth. He used every communication frequency the Valori possessed, from the lowest band radio waves to the highest quantum-entangled channels reserved for wartime emergencies. And he broadcast in 12 different languages, and in mathematical patterns, and in simple binary code. And he received nothing in return. The silence was total, and it was maddening, and it sat on the bridge of the command ship like a living thing that fed on the growing unease of the crew. The scout flotilla held its position in lunar orbit, 200 warships hanging in the shadow of Earth's pale moon, and their commanders reported that they could see the planet's surface in perfect detail through their optical scopes. Green forests and silver rivers and small clusters of structures that looked like they had been grown rather than built, and people moving among them, tiny figures walking through meadows and sitting beside streams. And none of the structures or people showed any signs of noticing the flotilla. Them were looking up. That was what disturbed Solek most of all. 12,000 alien warships had entered their solar system, and 200 were parked next to their moon, and not a single human on the surface showed any sign of caring. Then, without warning, a voice appeared. It did not come through the communication array, and it did not come through the emergency channels. and it did not come through the sealed and encrypted command lines that only the highest-ranking officers could access. It came through everything. Every speaker on every ship in the entire armada activated at the same moment, and the voice that poured out of them was calm and clear, and spoke in perfect High Vylori, the formal court language of the Dominion that had never been taught to any species outside the Empire, and that most Vylori themselves could not speak properly. "Welcome to the Sol system," the voice said, and it was neither male nor female, and it carried a warmth that felt strange coming from something that should have been afraid. "We are glad you have arrived safely, and we apologize for the delay in responding. We wanted to be sure of your intentions before we spoke." Solek gripped the railing of his command platform and said, "Identify yourself immediately. State your name and your rank and your authority to speak on behalf of your world." "We speak for all of humanity," the voice replied. "We do not use names the way you do, and we do not have ranks, and our authority comes not from a position of power, but from the simple fact that every human mind is in agreement about what we wish to say to you." "Every mind," Solek repeated. "Every single one. All 10 billion of us are aware of this conversation, and all 10 billion of us are participating in it. You are not speaking to a representative, Commandant. You are speaking to a species." Solek felt the bridge crew shift behind him, and he could taste their fear in the comma. "Recycled air. That is not possible," he said. "It was not possible for us once either," the voice said gently. "Things change, Commandant. Species grow. We are not what we were when we last broadcast into the stars. And we are not what your long-range probes told you we were. And we are certainly not what your Grand Sovereign believes us to be." "How do you know about the Grand Sovereign?" "We know about everything. We have been listening to the Vylori Dominion for a very long time. Your language, your history, your conquests, your music, your poetry, your children's stories. We find your civilization fascinating and in many ways beautiful, which is why this conversation is so difficult for us." Solek steadied himself and fell back on protocol, because protocol was the only solid ground he had left. "By the authority of Grand Sovereign Kael'tharion of the Vylori Dominion, I am authorized to accept your unconditional surrender. Military assets. Submit to occupation and transfer governance of your world to Dominion administration. You have one planetary rotation to comply. Failure to do so will result in the full application of military force." The voice was quiet for a long moment, and when it spoke again, the warmth was still there. But underneath it was something vast and heavy, like an ocean pressing against a dam. "We understand that you are following orders, and we do not hold that against you personally, Commandant Solek. You are a good officer and a decent being, and we can feel the conflict inside you even now." Solek flinched at the use of his name. "But Earth is not available for conquest," the voice continued. "This is not a negotiation, and it is not a request. It is simply a fact. The way gravity is a fact. The way light is a fact. Your fleet cannot take this world, and your weapons cannot harm it, and your soldiers cannot set foot on its surface. We are telling you this, not as a threat, but as a kindness so that you may leave with your lives and your dignity intact." "You are in no position to make demands," Solek said, and his voice was harder now, because hardness was all he had. "I command 12,000 warships and 3 planet-cracking siege engines and 2 billion armed soldiers. Your world has no visible defenses, no fleet, no orbital installations. You are a garden full of farmers, and you are asking me to be afraid of you." "Yes," the voice said simply, "we are." "Then you are deluded." "We are many things, Commandant, but deluded is not one of them. We have watched your dominion conquer worlds for thousands of years, and we have grieved for every species that fell beneath your advance, and we chose not to intervene because it was not our place. But our home is our home, and this is where we draw our line. And if I cross that line—" The voice paused again, and when it returned, there was a sadness in it, so deep that several officers on the bridge felt their eyes sting with tears they could not explain. "Then what follows will not be punishment," the voice said. "It will simply be a boundary, and we will take no pleasure in it, and we will carry the weight of it forever. Please, Commandant, we are asking you, not as a civilization to a fleet, but as one thinking, feeling being to another. Please take your ships and go home. Go home to your families. Go home to your worlds. There is no glory here. There is no conquest here. There is only a line that cannot be crossed." The transmission ended. Every attempt to re-establish contact failed, and the voice was simply gone, as if it had never been. Solek stood alone on his bridge, surrounded by officers who would not meet his eyes, and he thought about what the voice had said, and he thought about his orders, and he thought about his family on the throne world, and the oath he had sworn when he accepted his commission. Then he opened the fleet channel and gave the order for the full armada to advance to Earth orbit and begin invasion protocols. On the Iron Fang, Sub-Commander Cole heard the order and felt his stomach drop. And beside him, Shipmaster Golren closed his one good eye and whispered something that might have been a prayer to gods the Valori had stopped believing in centuries ago. 12,000 warships began to move inward toward the small blue world, and the planet crackers powered up their main guns with a hum that resonated through the hulls of every ship within 1,000 kilometers. Far away on the throne world, High Oracle Sylith was not listening to the fleet communications, because she was deep in the oldest archive in the Dominion, a vault that contained records from before the Empire existed. From the time of the precursors, the ancient and vanished civilization that had built the hyperstream corridors that connected the galaxy. She had been searching for days, and now she had found something that stopped her heart. It was a navigational beacon record from a precursor survey ship that had passed through the Sol system over 100,000 years ago. And carved into the beacon in the precursor language was a warning that had never been translated, because nobody had ever thought it important enough to try. Sylith translated it now, and the words burned on her screen like fire. "Do not wake the builders. They are not gone. They are finished." She understood instantly what it meant, and she lunged for the emergency transmitter and sent a recall order to the fleet with every watt of power the station could produce. The signal raced across the stars at the speed of the hyperstream relay network. It would arrive 12 minutes after the fleet opened fire. 12 minutes too late. The first celestial armada of the Valori Dominion entered high orbit around Earth in full battle formation, and from a distance, it looked like a second ring had formed around the planet. A ring made not of ice and rock, but of metal and malice. 12,000 warships arranged themselves in layered shells around the blue world below, with the heavy battleships and siege platforms in the outer ring, and the troop carriers and support vessels tucked safely in the middle, and the 3 massive planet crackers positioned at the cardinal points, like the tips of a spear aimed at the planet's heart. Sub-Commander Dravon Cole stood at his station aboard the Iron Fang, and looked down at Earth through the observation window. And even knowing what he was here to do, he could not help but think that it was the most beautiful world he had ever seen. The oceans were a blue so deep, it looked like the planet was made of sapphire, and the continents were covered in green so rich, seemed to glow, and great white spirals of cloud moved across the surface with a slowness that made the whole world look like it was breathing. And somewhere down there, 10 billion beings were going about their lives, in meadows and forests and beside rivers. And they were about to have the sky torn open above them. Cole closed his journal and put it away because he did not want to write what was about to happen. On the command ship, Commandant Solek gave the final order with a voice that was steady and flat, and showed nothing of what was happening behind his eyes. "All batteries, target designated population centers, fire on my command." Across the fleet, 12,000 warships turned their weapons toward the surface, and the targeting systems searched for military installations, and found none, and searched for industrial complexes, and found none, and searched for government buildings, and found none, and so they defaulted to the next priority on the list, which was population centers, and they locked onto settlements scattered across the green continents below. Fire. The fleet fired, and nothing happened. Every energy beam, every plasma lance, every kinetic projectile, every missile and torpedo and bombardment round that 12,000 warships could throw at a planet screamed downward toward the surface in a wall of destruction that should have burned the atmosphere itself. And at a point roughly 400 kilometers above the surface, every single one of them simply ceased to exist. Not deflected, not absorbed, not detonated prematurely, not intercepted by any visible countermeasure. They just stopped being. The energy beams did not scatter or reflect. They were there, and then they were not, as if someone had pressed a button and unwritten them from reality. And the missiles did not explode. They simply vanished between one instant and the next, like drops of water falling into an ocean so vast. It did not even notice them. And the kinetic rounds, which were nothing more than massive chunks of dense metal moving at incredible speed, just disappeared without leaving so much as a flash of light to mark where they had been. The silence that followed was worse than any explosion. Solek stared at the tactical display and saw 12,000 ships reporting successful weapons discharge and zero impact on the target. And his mind tried to process this information and failed, because there was no framework in Valori military science for a weapons discharge that resulted in absolute nothingness. "Fire again," he said. They fired again. The same thing happened, or rather the same nothing happened. Every single projectile and beam vanishing at exactly the same altitude as before, 400 kilometers above the surface, as if there was a line drawn around the planet that simply said, no. "Planet crackers," Solek said, and his voice was very quiet now. The 3 planet crackers were the pride of the Valori war machine. Each one a vessel 3 kilometers long, built around a single weapon so powerful that it could split a planet's mantle open like an egg, and reach down into the molten core and tear the world apart from the inside. They fired. 3 beams of energy so intense that they were visible to the naked eye across the entire fleet, lanced downward toward Earth. And any one of them could have reduced the planet to a field of molten rubble spinning in the void. The beams reached the 400-kilometer line and vanished, as if they had never been, swallowed by something that did not care how powerful they were. Something that treated the mightiest weapons in the Valori arsenal the way an adult might treat a child's tantrum, with a patience so vast it was indistinguishable from indifference. Then the voice came back. It appeared on every channel one last time, and it was still calm, and still warm, and still carried that terrible sadness that pressed against the walls of the soul like deep water. "You were warned." 2 words, and then silence, and then 11 seconds that would be remembered for as long as anything in the galaxy was remembered. It started at the edges. The outermost ring of ships, the perimeter guard vessels that floated at the fringe of the formation, simply went dark, and Cole saw it happen through the observation window. And at first, he thought their power had failed, because their running lights blinked out, and their engines went quiet, and they just hung in space like dead things. Then they began to dissolve. There was no other word for it. The hull plating of the nearest ship seemed to lose its solidity, becoming translucent, like ice melting in reverse. And Cole could see through the walls of the vessel, for a brief, terrible moment, could see the shapes of crew members inside, frozen at their stations. Translucence deepened into transparency, and the transparency deepened into nothing, and the ship was gone. Not destroyed, not exploded, not broken apart. Gone. As if reality itself had decided that the ship had never existed, and had quietly erased it, the way one might erase a word written in pencil. And it was spreading inward, Ship after ship after ship went dark and dissolved, ring after ring of the formation vanishing in a wave that moved inward toward the center, with the slow, inevitable patience of a tide coming in. And there was no sound, because space carries no sound. But if there had been, it would have been the sound of silence eating everything. Cole watched the ships around the Iron Fang disappear one by one, each one taking 2 or 3 seconds to fade from solid metal to empty space. And the crews aboard them had no time to escape, and no time to scream, and no time to do anything at all, because the dissolution was not violent. It was gentle. It was almost tender in the way it unmade them, like a hand closing softly around a candle flame. Golren sat in his command chair and watched the destruction approaching, and he did not give orders to flee, because there was nowhere to flee to, and he did not give orders to fight, because there was nothing to fight. And instead, he looked at Cole and said, "Write something, boy. Someone should remember." Cole opened his journal with shaking hands and wrote one line, pressing so hard that the stylus nearly cracked the screen. "They are not a civilization. They are something else." Then the Iron Fang went dark, and the lights died, and the engine stopped, and Cole felt a warmth pass through him like sunlight through a window. And he had one final thought, which was that it did not hurt. And then he was gone, and the Iron Fang was gone, and the space where they had been was empty and clean. On the command ship, Solek stood alone on his bridge, because his crew had already dissolved around him, and he watched through the viewport as the last ships in the fleet faded and vanished, and he had perhaps 18 seconds left. He did not spend them in fear. He spent them in understanding, because in those final moments, as the dissolution reached the hull of his own ship, and he could feel reality thinning around him like fabric worn so fine you could see light through it, he understood what humanity was. They had not built weapons because they did not need weapons. They had not built defenses because they did not need defenses. They had not built cities or factories or power grids because they had moved beyond the need for any of it. They had done what every civilization in the galaxy dreamed of and none had ever achieved. They had transcended. They had stepped beyond the boundary between matter and something greater. And the 10 billion bodies walking in gardens on the surface below were not all of what they were, chose to remain in physical form because they enjoyed the feeling of grass under their feet and sunlight on their faces. Earth was not primitive. Earth was post-everything, and the Veilori had tried to conquer a species that had become part of the architecture of reality itself. Solek smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind he had not worn since he was young. And then the warmth took him, and he dissolved into nothing, and the command ship was gone. 11 seconds from start to finish. 12,000 warships, 3 planet crackers, 2 billion souls, erased. Not destroyed, because destruction leaves something behind, wreckage and radiation and the echoes of violence. This left nothing at all. The space around Earth was pristine again, empty and clean and perfect, as if the largest invasion fleet in galactic history had never existed, as if it had been nothing more than a dream that the universe had woken up from, and immediately forgotten. On the throne world, every display connected to the first celestial armada flatlined at the same instant. 12,000 signals cutting out simultaneously in the time it took to draw a single breath. Grand Sovereign Kael'tharion stood before the tactical sphere and watched the violet markers of his fleet vanish one by one, until the sphere showed nothing but the small yellow star of Sol surrounded by empty space. High Oracle Salith stood behind him, with tears running down her silver face and her recall order still blinking unsent on her console, because the relays had processed it 12 minutes too late. The war room was silent. For the first time in 12,000 years, the Valori Dominion had encountered something it could not conquer, and could not comprehend, and could not outrun. And somewhere across the stars, a small blue planet turned peacefully in the light of its sun, beautiful and quiet, and wrapped in the silence of something so far beyond empire that the word had no meaning. And in a meadow beside a river, a human child looked up at the sky and smiled at nothing in particular, and then went back to picking flowers. 6 months after the disappearance of the first celestial armada, the Valori Dominion was a thing held together by nothing more than habit and fear, and both were running out. The news had spread despite every effort to contain it, leaking through encrypted channels and whispered conversations, and the trembling voices of intelligence officers who could not keep silent about what they had seen on their screens. 12,000 signals alive one moment and gone the next, and now every world in the Empire knew that 2 billion of their sons and daughters and mothers and fathers had been sent to conquer a small blue planet, and had simply vanished as if they had never been born. There were no bodies to bury, and no wreckage to recover, and no battlefield to visit, and no enemy to hate. And that was the worst part of it, because grief needs a direction, and when there is nowhere to point it, the grief turns inward and eats everything it touches. On the throne world, the grand sovereign Kael'tharion had become a ghost, haunting his own palace, and the being who had once commanded 9,000 star systems with a voice like grinding stone now sat alone in the war room, day after day, watching the final telemetry recording on an endless loop, 12,000 signals vanishing in a single breath, over and over and over again, as if watching it enough times might somehow change the ending. He did not eat, and he did not sleep, and he did not respond when his advisors spoke to him, and the empire he had built through millennia of conquest crumbled around his feet like a sandcastle meeting the tide, because the provincial governors smelled weakness, and the client states sensed opportunity, and the rival powers circled like predators who had been waiting for exactly this moment. But Kael'tharion did not care about any of that anymore, because he had looked into the face of something so far beyond his understanding that it had broken the part of him that believed he mattered. High Oracle Salith was the one who held things together, and she did it not out of loyalty to the sovereign or love for the empire, but out of a desperate need to understand what had happened, and an even more desperate hope that understanding might lead to something other than despair. She gathered every scientist and analyst and historian the Dominion had, and she locked them in a research complex, and she told them to find answers. And after 6 months of work, they presented their findings to her in a report that she read 3 times before she believed it. Humanity had undergone what the scientists called a technological singularity approximately 40 years ago, a moment when their artificial intelligence and their biological consciousness and their understanding of physics had all crossed a threshold at the same time, and merged into something entirely new. They had not built a great machine, or a vast computer network, or a weapon of unimaginable power. They had instead merged their consciousness with the fundamental fabric of space-time itself, weaving their minds into the operating system of reality, the way a thread might be woven into a tapestry that was already infinite. The bodies walking on Earth's surface were not all of what humans were. They were projections, physical forms chosen and maintained by beings who existed simultaneously across dimensions that the Valori did not have the mathematics to describe. And the reason Earth's orbital space was clean was not because the humans had tidied up, but because when you are part of the structure of the universe, you do not need satellites any more than an ocean needs a cup. The silence that had fallen over Earth 40 years ago was the moment of transcendence, the moment when 10 billion minds had stopped being separate and had become one thing that was also 10 billion things at the same time. And they had stopped broadcasting because they no longer needed signals to communicate. They were the signal. They were the medium through which signals traveled. They were the space between the stars. And then Salith found the connection that made her hands shake. The precursors, the ancient vanished civilization that had built the hyperstream corridors connecting the galaxy. The species that every galactic power assumed had gone extinct millions of years ago, had not gone extinct at all. They had been the ancestors of humanity, or perhaps the first draft of what humanity would become, and they had built the hyperstream network as their final gift to the younger species of the galaxy before they had transcended beyond the need for physical infrastructure. The warning on the navigational beacon had been literal. Do not wake the builders, because they are not gone, and they are not sleeping, and they are not hiding. They are finished, finished with empire, and finished with conquest, and finished with the small brutal games that young civilizations play, and they simply want to be left in peace to exist as part of everything. The Veilori had tried to conquer a species that built the roads the Veilori traveled on. Salith made a decision that would have been called treason 6 months ago, but that now was simply called necessity. She commandeered a single unarmed diplomatic vessel, the smallest and least threatening ship in the Veilori fleet, and she flew it herself across the stars to the Sol system. And she crossed into Earth space, fully expecting to be erased the way the Armada had been erased. Instead, the voice met her at the edge of the system, and it was warm and welcoming, and it said simply, "We have been hoping someone would come." She was guided to Earth's surface, her little ship descending through clean air and white clouds until it settled in a meadow beside a wide, slow river, surrounded by trees so tall they seemed to hold up the sky. And what she found there broke her heart in the best possible way. Humans were everywhere, walking through the grass and swimming in the river, and sitting in circles, talking and laughing, and children ran between the trees playing games that involved a lot of shouting and falling down. And someone somewhere was singing, and the air smelled like flowers and warm earth and something sweet that she could not identify. They were kind to her. An elderly human with brown skin and white hair and eyes that held a depth she could not measure sat beside her on the riverbank and offered her a piece of fruit, and spoke to her in perfect high Veilori. And she realized after a moment that this was the voice, or rather one expression of the voice, one of 10 billion faces that the voice could wear. She asked the question that had been burning inside her for 6 months. Are they dead, the 2 billion? Are they gone? The elderly human looked at her with those impossibly deep eyes and smiled. They spoke. Their voice was gentle, the way rain is gentle. No one died. Salith could not breathe. When we dissolved the fleet, we did not destroy the consciousness of any being aboard those ships, the human continued. Destruction is easy, and it is beneath us. Instead, we removed their physical forms and stored their consciousness outside of material space, in a place that has no name in your language, but that you might think of as a pause between heartbeats. They are all there, every single one, 2 billion minds intact and unharmed and unaware of any passage of time. You can return them, Salith whispered. We can and we will, the human said. Every single one, restored to their original bodies on their homeworlds, with no pain and no trauma and no memory of suffering. They will remember the fleet, and they will remember the advance, and they will remember the warning, and then they will remember waking up in their own beds, as if from a dreamless sleep. Sleep. What do you want in return? One promise, the human said, that the Veilori Dominion will never again approach Sol with hostile intent, not because we are afraid, but because we do not wish to do this again. Every consciousness we had to remove from existence, even temporarily, is a weight we carry. We felt each one of those 2 billion minds as we took them, and we held each one of them gently, and we will release each one of them with care. But it is a terrible thing to unmake a being even for a moment, and we do not want to be the kind of existence that does terrible things. Salith was crying, and she did not try to stop, because some tears are not weakness, but rather the only sane response to grace. "You could destroy us," she said. "You could unmake the entire Dominion in seconds, every ship and every world and every living being. You have that power." "Yes. Then why did you not?" The elderly human picked up a small stone from the riverbank and held it in the light and turned it so that it sparkled. And they said, "Because power is not measured by what you can destroy, but by what you choose not to. And we choose this. We choose the river and the meadow and the fruit and the children playing in the trees. We choose to be kind even when we do not have to be, especially when we do not have to be. Because that is what it means to be finished. Not finished as in ended, finished as in complete." Salith made the promise right there on the riverbank, with the sound of children laughing in the background, and the smell of flowers in the air. And the human smiled, and touched her hand, and she felt a warmth move through her, that she would carry for the rest of her very long life. 1 week later, 2 billion Valori soldiers woke up. They woke in their own beds, on their own homeworlds, in their own homes. And they sat up and blinked and looked around, and remembered the fleet and the advance toward Earth, and the voice warning them to turn back. And then they remembered nothing at all until this moment, waking up warm and rested and alive. The comm networks of the Dominion nearly collapsed under the weight of the calls that followed. Families reaching out to families, parents hearing the voices of children they had mourned for half a year, partners holding each other and shaking and refusing to let go. It was not a military victory, and it was not a political resolution, and it was not a peace treaty. It was mercy, and mercy is the most terrifying weapon in the universe, because you cannot fight it, and you cannot defend against it, and you cannot pretend it does not change everything. Grand Sovereign Kael'tharion abdicated his throne 3 days later, and he did it quietly, without ceremony or spectacle, simply placing the crown on the empty seat and walking away into a corridor, and never being seen in public again. And some said he spent his remaining years in a small room, somewhere staring at the stars and trying to understand what he had provocation. And some said he never did. The Valori Dominion did not collapse, but it changed, slowly and painfully and imperfectly, the way all real change happens. And it began the long, difficult work of becoming something other than an engine of conquest, not because it had been defeated, but because it had been shown that there was something greater than victory. Salith became the new leader, not a sovereign but a guide, and she led not through fear, but through the memory of a meadow beside a river, and an old human holding a stone in the light. On the night after the soldiers returned, she stepped out onto the balcony of her quarters on the throne world, and looked up at the sky. The stars were the same stars they had always been, cold and distant, and scattered across the darkness like spilled diamonds. Except for one. In the constellation the Valori called the Crown, right at its center, where no star had been before. There was a new light, small and faint and warm and golden, and it shone with a steadiness that was nothing like the cold flicker of distant suns. It was in the direction of Sol. Silith stared at it for a long time, and she thought about the voice, and the meadow, and the river, and the children, and the terrible gentle power that could unmake a fleet in 11 seconds, and then put every single soul back together again out of nothing but compassion. And she understood what the light was. It was not a weapon, and it was not a warning, and it was not a signal. It was a porch light. Humanity had left a light on for the rest of the galaxy, a small warm glow in the darkness that said you are not alone, and you do not have to be afraid. And when you are ready to visit as friends, the door is open. Silith smiled, and she whispered into the night air words that no Valori had ever said before, and that she hoped many would say after. Thank you. And far away across the black ocean of space, a small blue planet turned in the light of its star, and 10 billion minds that were also one mind felt the whisper arrive like a raindrop landing on still water. And they smiled with 10 billion faces, and the porch light burned a little brighter, and the galaxy was never quite the same again.